diagrams too, because even, just the visuals to explain this stuff is often a labor of love, and these really have been. So my screen should pop up in a sec. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you speaking about this as a culmination of sacred capital work in the beginning too, because from my seat as someone holding some of the technicals, it feels like it's kind of more of a simplification, and that a lot of the work we've done has been just wrapping the stuff up into something that is digestible and makes sense to people outside of the nitty-gritty insides like we've been. So to sort of start with illustrating that, this piece of diagram here, just to lay the foundations, is really a summary of everything we spoke about on the last ecosystem session I was a part of. So the whole big technical architecture of the cultural computer, this big monster of a diagram here we went through, and a lot of the pieces in it, and how it sort of looks internally, and what we mean by reputation specifically when we're speaking about how it operates for a particular person as a particular sense-making node among a collective of individuals. And so reducing all that down here to just this idea that there is a cultural computer, and like all computers, we can think of it as sort of a black box where you plug in reputation data that can be from traditional websites or distributed web apps, and you plug in cultural computations that you design yourself, and it spits out reputation scores at the other side that you can feed back in to do more computations with and build up complexity. And that's sort of the summary of everything we spoke about last time. Yeah, Sid.
Just to dwell on this, are you done, Paspi?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think just to dwell on this a little more, an example of a reputation data type might be timestamps, and the reputation score is, are you punctual or not? And so each computation can be different. Different communities will hold it differently. Some might define punctuality pretty strictly. Some might be pretty liberal with it. And so that's one kind of computation. You might also have reputation data types as likes or claps, and the score might be your rank in the feed, in the social media feed. And so if you're a meme sharing community or some kind of social network, a virtual social network, you might have posts showing up on the basis of the culture of the group. So in a project like Junto, each group could potentially decide the order of their feed based on their culture. So you don't have the feed, centrally decided by a Zuckerberg, but it's actually locally changeable and articulated at the community level. So that is an example of what a reputation score would achieve.
Yeah, cool. And so I want to sort of take that as the fundamental piece as an agent, if we're going to be in the agent-centric web and speaking about it through that lens. So this is Alice and her sense-making node, where she can make reputation scores to make sense of the different things she's involved in. And so to speak about what this means in social terms, really everything I'm going to speak about from here forward is back to our original to the start of this conversation. Like, a lot of it is speaking about just some of those small registration pieces that we don't need to go into in detail. Mostly this is just about taking this piece, like the individual sovereign being that knows how to make sense of things and make computed judgments and evaluations or cultural assumptions about them. How does data flow between us as individuals in order to make bigger sense and more nuanced, accurate sense about things as groups? So from that first step of being a single individual, we might step into being multiple people, and how do we make sense together? And with that, it's really a case of remembering that everybody, being their own coherent unit of sense making, has access to their own data from their own web accounts on other things and their own distributed websites, distributed web apps. And that we can pass these cultural computations between each other in order to compute data based on the same computations. So you can start to build up sense making together by all working off similar or the same source data sets and being able to cross-verify with each other that things are indeed as they're said to be. And so once we have this ability to kind of cross-check each other's work, then the next step is being able to cohere that together. And some of these pictures need to, there we go, load nicely. Being able to cohere together into some group of people, which is this idea that we're calling a neighborhood, where it's kind of a bunch of individuals together and the shared culture, in this case, these group computations that we're all designing together, and the shared reputation data about each of our individual contributions and performance within this collective. All of that gets put together in what we're calling a neighborhood context, or neighborhood culture registry in this point, because it's where we're registering all these different pieces in regard to the culture of the group, and that we can start to create group units of understanding and coherence on that basis, where a group is really just the sum of its parts in terms of all the cultural computations that we're agreeing to assess each other's worth by, or contributions, or however you want to frame it, and all of the data that we've used to do so over time. I'm just going to pause there for a second, but you're all nodding, so that's good. So moving from being able to form coherence as a group together, the next thing becomes, well, what happens when you're outside of that group, and how do you see inside it? So here we've got some new colors being introduced, where there are people within the group, Bob and Alice, who are indicated as what we're calling mimetic bridges. And so this is again part of the neighborhood culture registry. And I guess a bigger thing to say about all this is that we're really talking about a reputation fabric and a way of computing and making sense together that's modeled on the way that human beings really function in groups and how we operate. And so, you know, this is all about, well, how do we get to a point of even having a group of friends and understanding who we are? But then from that point, it becomes the questions of like, okay, I'm not in the group, so how do I figure out what's going on in the group? And the answer is you ask someone who's in the group. And so in this case, we kind of, you register different people as being like the trusted members of that group who are responsible for answering on its behalf and who might make decisions for it, but not necessarily, you know, they could just be watchdogs or people with a stake in it. And you might think of it as like, you know, like the comms team in an organization might be a mimetic bridge into the organization, where they're the ones who are returning information about what's going on inside. And again, because of all this way that we can pass data around between each other, we can have someone externally either checking information that's been provided to them about what's going on inside the group, or providing their own computations to request that things that they're asking about be determined for them and returned from inside the group. So basically, there exists some ways of creating a count of trust and responsibility in terms of who answers about things, and then having people being able to peer in without being fully immersed in it and just kind of getting their own nuance into a space. So semi-permeable information transmission is sort of important, with not overwhelming people with information, but also not siloing completely so that there's no transmission at all. And then from there, we get some other things interestingly emerging. I wish these pictures wouldn't do that. Where you may have situations where you're talking about neighboring groups. So it could be like a few subreddits within the same parent Reddit, say, you know, like there's communities that already have strong relationships between each other. So often it's posts that you've made elsewhere influence whether you're allowed into this new space. And so here there's this sort of central orange neighborhood that Danielle's asking for access into. And to do that, she's kind of like first starting by asking, well, who's responsible for this neighborhood, and makes that request to find out who these mimetic bridges are who are making all of the cultural judgments about what's going on in there and who can enter and leave. And then she can then use that information to basically do the same thing as before, send the cultural computations around to them, ask them to verify her reputation in the foreign community based on their visibility into it. And also to note that there's this way here that neighborhoods are actually formed via kind of overlapping data in network spaces that different agents have access to. So the idea of a neighborhood, or even just a network in a holochain app, is something that sort of exists transiently in the space between people, and it exists kind of partially within each person as well. Like it's all overlapping in different sets. And then, of course, there's the most distant case where you're completely outside of the network that you're trying to enter. Come on. And so in this case, you can have another step removed where Danielle's asking to join. She figures out who's responsible, but they don't have any visibility into this information she's providing them about the old community subreddit, wherever she's coming from. So they can actually look up the identity of that community, look into its neighborhood culture registry and figure out who the mimetic bridges for that community are, and have them kind of forward the data back. So even when you're not directly a part of the foreign community, there are still ways that you can kind of pass that trust down the line to known parties who are sort of respected and responsible for servicing information about different places, and ask them to do that sense making on your behalf. And so you're always kind of deferring trust out to other parties, but there's always some recording and some attribution of where that data came from, and where nuance comes back to you in that process. And it will come back. Like there may be cases, say here, where Alice and Bob actually see different data about Danielle in a foreign neighborhood, and so they get different results. And so it's just sort of important to note that there is a point beyond which this can't really be automated, because it does come down to individual human sense making and some nuanced awareness about the reasons as to why Alice and Bob might see different things to Danielle that would lead to the group eventually allowing Danielle into the neighborhood she's requesting to join. Yeah, I think that's more or less it. I think there's not too much else in that I want to cover in any particular detail. But yeah, just a bit of a summary of how this starts to look in wider circles of coordinated groups when we start to move between them, and how we're using reputation to make informed decisions, allowing people to move around in this space.
I'll just quickly add, there's something to be said about efficiency. This diagram that Pospey's got up almost showcases how Daniel can enter a new neighborhood, and from day one, the engagement can be accelerated, because they're carrying with them all of this prior reputation data. So if Danielle has a sense of humor that aligns with this neighborhood, from day one, Danielle's memes would be showcased in that feed, because there's all of this reputation data that's relevant to this neighborhood. Or maybe if Danielle is a nice person or considered a nice person by this, culturally, she might be accepted as a couch surfing host more than, if she were just to enter as a stranger. Or if you are an entrepreneur and, or you've taken, you've not defaulted on any loans in the past, but you now enter a new neighborhood, your past transaction data can actually be ported in with you. And so from day one, you have great credit in this neighborhood as well. And so this approach through memetic bridges and porting of reputation data, I think drives efficiency in the long run, because it's not up to an app or platform to curate your engagement for you. And there's not this arms race for your data. Danielle, I need to know everything about you, and I'm going to track you all the time in order for you to have decent engagements on the internet. But instead, as you hop from one neighborhood to another, you actually carry your context with you. And in a way, I think that models reality. Most social circles that we enter, we don't enter as a stranger. You might know one person who introduced you to that circle, but you will also know so many others through other contexts. And that's how your engagement in these communities accelerates. And so I almost think of this as an accelerator, a social accelerator for the distributed web, which we haven't had, because you can't have a massive central AI in the sky that's doing this for us, because there's no universal snapshot of data in distributed environments. So I think this is almost like a ground up approach to engagement. And I think that drives efficiency in the long run, because you'll find, queries are run in much, you're not people's engagement is getting accelerated through their actions, but you also end up running queries in much smaller DHTs. You're not, platforms can run into, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users, and trying to do, run queries in them in the distributed web can get really clunky. But in the neighborhoods approach, you're just making really quick, nimble queries in much smaller DHTs, because you know exactly what to look for. And I think that might be, there might be a fantastic discussion around driving efficiency. So using a neighborhoods approach as opposed to a platform-based approach in the distributed web might be more efficient for you, even in terms of like cost.
Yeah,
so there's a lot to
something,
unpack, I
Emmeline.
think. Yeah.
There's something definitely that Emmeline was saying there too about, the kind of pinnacle of the dWeb has been seen as owning your own data to this point. And I noticed that most of the ways that people interact with dWeb data are about becoming the AI yourself and being able to ingest all the information you have and run some processing on it. And there's, I mean, you're speaking mostly to social efficiencies in what you're saying, but the computational and energy efficiencies in terms of raw wattage and what's being done are really interesting to me as well. Because there's obviously the element in this where Danielle is only bringing the data that she needs to bring at the moment she needs to bring, and it's not being recomputed for her in real time continually to mine for profit kind of thing. But there's also the aspects here where, because these reputation scores are being generated as separate holochain DNAs, there's a finality and a content addressability about that takes away a whole bunch of unnecessary computation, because here, where Alice and Bob are querying, who's the medic bridges of this neighborhood, there's only one, it's Estelle. And they're both actually asking Estelle the same question. Well, Estelle only has to compute that result once for them. And once it's there, she's like, well, I've already done that. Here's the hash. So I think there's an opportunity for a kind of slower, more static, more in place kind of big data processing that happens here. And maybe that's one of the key differences we could talk about between little data and big data someday, is that little data is doesn't move as much continually because it doesn't need to. But yeah, it is really interesting. And there's a group we've been speaking to a little bit, well, I have anyway, Second Nature Lab, who are interested in doing things like trying to figure out the actual wattage and the carbon footprint of running an online organization and all the hosting infrastructure they use and computers and et cetera, et cetera. And if we're talking about being able to prototype something like that on Holochain, then cool, we've actually got HoloFuel that's a measure of clock cycles and storage. So there is a more accurate way that we could potentially do those kinds of things, which would be really interesting. I'm going to stop sharing. I think that stopped sharing. My Zoom messes itself out and I can't tell if it stopped sharing, but I think that's...
Oh, you have, yeah.
Okay,
That's
good.
Thank you. There is one piece, one more piece, and maybe we could get into that. The low code marketplace and the neighborhoods credit, unless you have a question, David. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Lovely visuals. And for people, yeah, some of it is available on the website, but what I really want to get into is, we spoke about neighborhoods as the design framework and leveraging the cultural community, a cultural computer for people to come together, which allows these communities to articulate their specific cultures. But a piece here that we're hoping to accelerate are generic tools like that elemental chat, elemental chess, that communities will be able to plug in. And so there's a currency that we've been designing to accelerate that flow, or to start that flow, because we think that flow is currently broken, because currently most devs aren't, or I would say end up going down the route of the platform developer, which means once you've created that code, you then start thinking about, I need to go fundraise. I need to then start thinking about how I'm onboarding users and how I'm engaging my users. But instead, what we're really looking for is a thriving, replenishable flow of generic modular agent-centric widgets, which means the community should be able to plug in a chat app or a chess app or a Reddit clone app or a peer-to-peer lending app within their membrane. And so the neighborhoods credit, think of it as a currency that sparks that flow. And so each credit is backed by dev resources, which we're articulating as, 1 human hour required to build these widgets. And so each credit represents a certain number of human hours that it would take. And so, you might say elemental chat took 100 human hours to develop. And so that would be represented in neighborhoods credits. And so neighborhood credit are these is a unit of account in this marketplace, which allows communities access to these generic tools, and it allows communities to transfer value to these developers who are making these. And so it actually, allows, I think, this new brand of developer that are more, for lack of a better word, widgety, and like to stitch things together in the holochain ecosystem or any agent-centric ecosystem, and roll out these generic tools. Emmeline, if you, feel free to jump in if you've got any thoughts.
Just wanting to point out, like, for me, what a big deal this is, in the sense that, like, I think from my view, basically the whole holochain community has been kind of in inquiry about, like, what are like, how do you fund, and what are viable business models for the distributed web? And of course that's going to look quite different for every use case, but at the same time, like, model that we're used to with Web 2 platforms, basically, of course, is like the sort of data mining, data extraction model, like where you get free tools in exchange for, like, total lack of data autonomy, total lack of privacy, this sort of thing, right? So then in terms of thinking about, like, what is a fair way to to fund development in a way that in a way that's like fair pay for developers, that actually takes into account, like, their hours worked and, like, the effort expended, but that doesn't necessarily ride on, kind of like the speculative value that's generated from data markets, basically, which is how most of Web 2 thrives, right? So there's kind of like a multiplier almost that comes from the data extraction paradigm. And so in a lot of ways, this is very healing, I think, or like a nice foot to sort of start off on, is like, we're imagining a marketplace that is very much kind of like a code commons. And we're still in, like, active design on this, but basically, like, trying to suss out how we can create a sort of like capped system, basically, where, developer work hours as honest work hours are honored, but that, those costs can be sort of distributed among multiple different communities of use, right? Like, up into a certain threshold, at which point, it might be possible for devs to feel like, hey, I got mine. Now this is sort of free for other neighborhoods, or for neighborhoods that maybe, like, can't, pay, can't pay the sort of costs that it would require to build a whole separate app suite, right, for your community. So in the sense that this is a commons based marketplace where we're sort of trying to design toward a code commons, this credit is specifically created to work toward that, in the sense of looking at hours worked, right, rather than like amount of downloads, for example, like some sort of system where it's possible to sort of like hit the jackpot in this, like, egregious sort of Silicon Valley way,